Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Kristin Stoller, and I'm the careers reporter at Forbes, and I'm here with Mike Radice, the head of recruiting at Toptal. Mike, so nice to be here with you.
Kristin, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Excellent. So, Mike, I know you've been at Toptal for 3.5 years now, but the company itself has been fully remote for over a decade, which I find fascinating, especially as someone who's just, started this new experiment of working remotely myself. So, I wanted to focus today on the best practices for companies who, like the rest of us, are navigating how to hire remotely. Do you want to start us off by giving some tips for companies on how to write a good job posting or description for a remote job candidate?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to. And, TopTel, I mean, we have spent the last 10 years being a remote function. We were born that way. And I think it's something that has led us to find some of these lessons out the hard way and also be a little bit more creative when it came to attracting some talent. But, talking about job description, I think the number one thing that everybody can be doing is become at the very beginning, get yourself very clear about what the role means to you. Why are you hiring it? What needs to be done? What does success really look like? This is as much to help you as it is to help your potential candidates, because it really forces you to think through what their world is going to look like when they join the organization. And then from there, you want to be able to articulate it, right? So for us, we get a lot of compliments on our job descriptions, which is not always the most sexy part of recruiting, but we lay out a candidate's first week, first month, 3 months, 6 months, sometimes all the way out to the year. And for us, it's really valuable because by being intentional that early on, we're able to help shape their onboarding experience. And then we're able to track them as they go through their first year and make sure they're, measuring the success. They're either on path, maybe things need to get corrected, but we have a general idea of what this person's first year is going to look like. A couple of other tips. I mean, as an organization, we try our best to remain pretty flexible as it relates to title. This allows us to hire either up or down of our initial target of a profile. And then another thing that's helped us, we've been doing it for a few years now, and we've seen some success from it, is that we like to keep some of our tough roles posted all year long, and it keeps a pipeline of interested candidates. So if we have somebody who's excited to join TopTel, maybe they see the right job for them, but there's just not an opening. By throwing their hat in the ring, that's the first place that the recruiting team is going to when we open a role with similar skill sets, to see, hey, do we have somebody that might be interested in joining TopTel who reached out to us 3-6 months ago, but could still be a good fit and would be interested in taking a call from us.
That's so interesting because me as a former job seeker, whenever I see a listing that has been posted for over a year, I'm always really scared to apply for it. And it seems kind of counterintuitive to me. Can you elaborate on that a little more about why you do it?
Yeah, so we're very explicit that this is a future opportunity role, right? But for us, we keep it up that way so that a job seeker, a lot of times we find people who, as we're having these conversations with candidates, they tell us like, oh, TopTel's been on my radar for 6 months or a year, or we love what you're doing from a remote perspective. And so when we started getting a lot of that feedback, we realized, okay, there's a lot of these positions here where we're a lean company. We're 10 years old. I can't call us a startup yet, right? Or can't get rid of the startup title yet. But realistically, it's a little north of 700 employees in over 70 countries. So there's not a ton of duplication. If we have somebody who leaves, there's a lot of pressure on recruiting right away to say, okay, who's next person up? So for us, I think it's a good place for us to just have that source of candidates who have already raised their hand and said, hey, TopTel's on my radar. This is a place I could see myself being successful. And then it's a quick engagement. The timing doesn't always work out. To your point, folks that are in the midst of an active job search might have found something else by the end of it, but at least it opens the door to a dialogue, and maybe a year or two down the road, once that relationship has been built, we have the ability to bring somebody in for a different role.
Interesting. So now before you even get to that interview process, you put up the job posting, but what can you do as a company to ensure that you're fully prepared to be remote ahead of interviewing candidates?
Yeah, that's fortunately, TopTel has a team of people much smarter than me that really put their heads together and built something for this. So as a quick plug for our executive leadership team and our marketing team, we actually published an 80-page completely free, suddenly remote playbook to help organizations with this exact problem. I think a lot of our customers, people that work for companies that, we've had touch points with, just friends, family, like we were getting a lot of that of, hey, all of a sudden we're remote. How do we do this, right? So that's a great free how-to playbook. It's something that I think would be a great resource for anybody who's trying to figure these things out. But for us, I mean, I really boil it down to 2 or 3 things that are most important, right? I think number one is culture. And I can't emphasize that enough. The second is the tech stack, and the third is communication. So on the culture side, you have to clearly define your culture early on in your process. If your company's been up and running for a couple of years and you don't have your culture defined, it is going to be defined for you. So it's much better as leaders in an organization to kind of take the reins of that and really clearly define who are we, what are we about. I mean, we actually have a culture page up that we send to every candidate that's in the interview process. It's not the most warm and fuzzy document, right? But it's written for a purpose that way, because Toptal is a very, hard charging, aspirational, fast paced place to work, and not everybody loves that. So the culture page is something that we've designed so a candidate can read that and really get excited and go, oh, that's the exact kind of place I want to be. Or see very transparently what it's like to work here and go, maybe that's not for me. So I think before, the only reason our culture works from a remote perspective is because we defined what that is. And I think if you're going remote or you're transitioning into it, if that part of it's loose, the rest of the equation gets to be very complicated. The second piece, the tech stack, we live on Zoom and Slack. We're on videos all hours a day, internally and externally. From a Slack perspective, we barely are using emails unless we're communicating with folks outside of the organization. So it's something that sometimes takes our Outlook lifers a little bit of time to get adjusted to while they're here. But from a communication perspective in that tech stack, we're very clear with the new hires about our expectations. Hey, you're going to be on Slack all the time. You're appearing on video on Zoom. You're going to have shown up, on time, participating, hopefully with some level of personal grooming, before you dive into the meeting. But we expect people to participate, have input, right? So we lay all of this out in the onboarding. It's part of our handbook. If you're not clear about it and, honestly hammering it home for some of the offenders out there, people are always going to default back to what they're most comfortable with. So, our guidelines talk about proper grammar and punctuation from a communication perspective. We've all been on the receiving end or the sending end of a text that was misinterpreted, right? So when you're talking about 70 countries and all these different cultures, you have to be very, very clear. So, if we're seeing mistakes in these shared Slack channels, you'll get a little bit of a nudge. But it's a highly collaborative company. And so I think that communication piece, if that's not there, it's going to hurt so many of our initiatives.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And, communication is key. My mom actually gives me that advice all the time that, when you're dealing with different companies and cultures, you can't read too much into, emails and texts, and you have to be careful. So makes a lot of sense. So now you've put out the job description, you've identified candidates to interview. What type of interview path do you recommend using in a remote world?
Yeah, so you're going to hear me kind of beating a dead horse as we go through this theme. But I think for us, again, making sure we're going to have a candidate experience being phenomenal. You have to think through all of this stuff up front. So we hammer this out in advance. There's kind of 2 areas that I think are most relevant here. On one hand, we take the time to really invest in putting together a well-designed interview path. So recruiting has what we call an intake meeting with the hiring manager to really scope out the search. This is where they talk about, these are the kind of skills I need. This is the personality that's going to best fit with the team. If there's specific time zones that are better from a collaboration perspective, what are the comp expectations, all those kinds of things. So, the recruiting team, on the front end of this, we really measure our metrics around time to fill, what the average notice period is. So during that conversation, we can give the hiring manager like a rough estimate of how long it's going to take to fill a role. Then once that happens and we've taken care of getting the job description developed and posted, we have a kickoff meeting with not only the hiring manager, but all of the interviewers. And really this is to get everybody on the same page of, from our side, what are we looking for out of this position? And then on the candidate side, let's make sure they have a great varied sense of discussions, right? We've all been through those interview paths where the first interview question you get for every single conversation is, oh, so Mike, tell me a little bit about yourself, right?
Yep.
We try to keep that thing a little bit more varied so that every conversation is unique and different. And in that vein, in this kickoff meeting, we talk to the interviewers and make sure that each interviewer is assessing something different and is really focused on an area of their strengths, right? We're not going to have somebody that has not worked in a spreadsheet in their life talk about analytics. So that's our time to be able to just kind of make those necessary adjustments so that the team knows what everybody's looking for. And all of our interviewers are trained too. I think that's important to call out. Not only are they trained on just how to interview, how do you build interview sets of questions, having a repository of different questions that they can pull from, but we also train them on our expectations, right? How do you rate your interviews? We use a 1 to 4 scale, and each one of those numbers means something. How quickly do you get your feedback back for the recruiters? Because, we're kind of stuck in the mud until we hear if an interview went well or not. So all of these different things, the applicant tracking system, where do these notes live? Where can you access somebody's profile? Where does their link to their LinkedIn live? So I think we go pretty deep on training our interviewers so that they're well prepared too, because candidates are nervous. The last thing you want is having nervous interviewers too, because they're not quite sure what their responsibilities are.
Right.
And then after that, going back to the communications aspect, we open a private Slack channel for the role. It's a collaborative space for all the interviewers, anybody from the people team or, the recruiting operations team to be able to talk through things. Recruiters provide updates to the relevant stakeholders. Everybody has visibility into the progress of the search. And then there's some of that real-time collaboration when we're starting to find finalists. We'll compare pros and cons and things like that. And then, another piece of this is that we record a lot of our interviews, and especially for positions where there are going to be a lot of stakeholders who have a voice in the process, right? So I spent a lot of my time doing executive recruiting for the team, and you had to have most of the executive team buying in on any of those hires. And, that being said, if we had our interviewers going through like 12 or 13 interviews, I don't know, some companies do it. We try not to do that. So, we would record a lot of these interviews and then share them around the team. So that way stakeholders could get a sense of who their potential collaborator was. If they had questions that they saw from the interview, they could flag those things so that they were brought up in subsequent interviews. And it was a nice happy medium. We were able to more thoroughly assess the candidate, I think, in much less time. And the candidate was able to, move through these processes without having to do 100 different interviews. So on one side, there's that interview path. And I have another side of it, but I didn't want to cut you off.
No, I did actually. And you kind of touched on it yourself when you said, you don't want to make candidates do 12 or something interviews. I mean, I personally interviewed at companies where I've done 1 interview, or on the other hand, had ones where I've done more than 5 interviews. What to you is the sweet spot number of interviews that you think companies should do with a candidate?
Yeah, so for us, I'd say the sweet spot is somewhere between 3 and 4, which might sound like not a lot to some people, but we have another piece of this process that I think really helps us when it comes to evaluating our candidates, which is a candidate assessment, right? So we'll have 3 to 4 conversations with a candidate, and then we'll also have this assessment piece, which gives us a chance to, see some of the real work output from the candidate and determine if they have the necessary skills. I think that's always one of the things that is challenging in an interview process. You feel great about the person you're talking to, and they pass the "would I have a beer with this person" test, right? But then they get in there and can't do the job. So, we do an assessment piece for that, which helps a lot on the proving out of skills. But I think it's a huge value add to candidates too, because, if you're an expert at interviewing, you're probably not a good employee because you're doing so much interviewing, right? So the best people that you're talking to are not always going to be the most comfortable in an interview situation. So this is an additional data point that allows us to give the candidate another place where they could shine and show, something where they maybe go above and beyond other candidates. So I'd say, the combination of having it around 3 to 4 interviews and then also having some level of an assessment in place, it's been the right recipe for us. And I don't know, if you don't know after you talk to them 4 times, are you going to know?
I totally agree. You get tired after that. And so, as a journalist, someone who loves interviewing and is always looking for stories, I have to ask this question. Do you have any anecdotes or personal stories that you could share about a candidate who stood out to you during the interview process and what made their interview so successful?
Yeah, absolutely. And as I kind of touched on before, I've had the chance to be able to recruit for our executive team and a lot of our senior leadership positions. So I've been able to meet some phenomenal people over the years. I'd say the first one that probably stands out is my boss, our chief people officer. She went from initial discussion with me to an offer letter in 8 calendar days, which is not all that rare for Toptal. I know that our CEO had told me he had hired somebody in 3 or 4 days at one point, but for me, used to a month, 2 month type hiring cycle. That was pretty fast. And so, for her, she was awesome about accommodating different time zones and I think one of her interviews ended at 8 o'clock at night, and then she was up for a 7 a.m. the next day, just really rolled with the punches. And that mentality honestly was huge as far as the role that she was coming into. We were in this kind of expansion phase. We were breaking a lot of the things that we had built in the early stages of the company. And so there was a lot of new processes that were needing to be defined and culture needing to be more clearly articulated, and just a lot of changes that had to happen. So the indication of how flexible and easygoing she was, and like, yeah, okay, I'm a pro, I can handle this, really showed itself when she became a part of the team. And I mean, she's moved the needle in incredible ways. So that was one that stood out. I think another one, when we were hiring for another one of our executive positions, again, we have an assessment, and I think the time frame for the deliverable was somewhere between 3 to 5 hours that we were asking the candidate to input. The candidate that ended up getting hired for us, she asked me if she could get on a quick phone call to talk about the assessment. So I jump on. Typically folks have some questions, and she goes, "Mike, I got to tell you, if you're only looking for me to put 3 to 5 hours into this, then you're going to get a very low quality product here. It's not something I'm going to put my name on. So look, if that's the quality level you're looking for, this probably isn't right for me." So, I had to scramble a little bit, like, no, it's okay. Put as much time in as you want to this thing. Whatever it's going to take for you to put a product out in front of this team. Obviously you have a day job, so we're not looking for you to spend multiple weeks on it. So I have no idea how many hours she did spend. I'm sure a ton after I see the hours she puts in here, but what came back was head and shoulders above everything else that we had been seeing. And I think that was just a perfect example of, a scenario where a candidate can take that assessment and leverage it to catapult themselves up into that, top spot for us. And then she cruised through the rest of the interview process, and same kind of thing. I think it proved out really well, where she's done a lot to positively impact the organization.
That's so interesting. That's really cool. And then I guess on the other side of things, are there any red flags or signs that a candidate you're interviewing is not going to be a good fit for the job, or even a good fit for a remote type of environment?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely red flags as it relates to the job around just kind of that low hanging fruit of, can they answer these questions articulately? Do they understand what they're talking about? Can they explain it to you who may not be a subject matter expert? That's a hat that I love to play in recruiting, of just, I do not know everything about all of these different departments. So why would you make that decision? How did you get to that path? If you're getting a lot of fluff and not a lot of substance, chances are, maybe they were part of that initiative, but as opposed to the way they wrote it on their resume where they were spearheading it, it might be a little bit more like, okay, I was in the room taking notes while somebody else was doing it. But as it relates to the remote environment, I think the easiest one for us to spot is technical issues, right? As I mentioned before, we're always on Zoom and Slack. So if a candidate can't get their Zoom to work, or keeps having audio issues or internet connectivity issues, it's something we'll pay attention to. Our whole mentality is, getting into Toptal and not having your tech work is like driving to the office and being locked in the parking garage. It doesn't do any good for anybody. So, I think for us, that's a piece that is pretty important. The other side of it is just the ability to follow directions, or inability to follow directions. I think anytime you're seeing a candidate show up late or miss something, or, only get on audio, even though we said it was a video, there's a lot of attention to detail that we need in our environment. And so missing some of that early on tends to be a red flag. I also look at when folks are rescheduling interviews, right, or continuing to push interviews back. Look, if it happens once in the process, life happens, and we don't really measure that. But if you start seeing it happening over and over again, or it seems impossible to get on their calendar, you really start to wonder, one, if the candidate has time management or organizational issues, or two, if they're really committed to this, right? Like as I mentioned, we're an ambitious company that's growing fast. And so you want people who are excited about joining. And when you see people just continuing to push off interviews, I don't know, sometimes it's a sign that something else is going on, whether they're not ready to make a change or maybe they're waiting for another offer. So that's something we kind of keep an eye out on it. The last two couple of things I'd say are probably when we look for somebody, when we're talking to somebody who's just moved to a new city, if they've never been remote before, that can sometimes be a challenge because, being remote can be isolating. And if you don't have, I think Toptal's culture is great as it relates to being collaborative and, spending time with your colleagues and everybody being willing to jump on a video call at a moment's notice just to make sure that they're helping out. But not every remote organization is like that. And, we have had a couple of times where somebody joins the team, is like all excited about the remote thing. They move to some part of the world where they don't know anybody and sometimes don't even know the local language. And then they're like, oh my God, what am I doing here? And so that's something, it's not going to necessarily be the deal breaking deciding factor, but it's a data point. And then lastly, and this is a little bit more subjective, but we really push our interviewers to trust their guts too, right? Like we're a highly analytical, data-driven company. There's a lot of things that we pay attention to through the interview process. But at the end of it, an interview is an interaction between a couple of humans. And so we all have those internal mechanisms built in place. There's plenty of times where we see candidates kind of being pushed through the process. Like, yeah, they could do the job, but there's something preventing the interviewers from standing there and going, absolutely, this is the person that I think is going to make a big addition on our team. And we call that out. As recruiters, we do everything we can to flag that as early as possible and say, like, hey, let's jump on a 5-minute call and talk about it. And a lot of times, whether it's a call or we just dive deep into the channel and start talking about it in Slack, everybody gets, starts bubbling up what their concerns are. And if you start seeing some of the same concerns, it gets a lot easier to make those decisions. And so we're big proponents of the philosophy that, at the end of the day, a candidate is either a hell yes or a hell no. And if you're not able to give that enthusiastic endorsement, especially as a hiring manager, we're going to recommend, hey, it's probably best to keep looking until you really feel that way.
Interesting. Now, I want to go back to something you just brought up. Say you have that hell yes candidate and you're really excited, but you're kind of getting the sense that they have other offers or are considering other companies. What can you do to put them over the edge to be interested in your own company instead?
Yeah, that is every day. I think if you're going after the right people, you're going to be in competition for those folks, right? There's always those things that you can, especially in startups, I think there's a little bit more flexibility about how is the company structured? Can you give away, whether it's equity or pieces of the, organization that gets people really motivated? You don't want to go down that money only road because, eventually that runs out, and it obviously puts you in a challenge from a startup perspective when you're a little bit more resource constrained. But, for us, by the time we're getting to the end of that conversation with a candidate, we'll have 4, 5, 6 hours of information that we've covered with them. We have this assessment. They've invested a lot of time in us. We should know what their major triggers are. Like, I ask that question of doesn't matter what level in the organization I'm interviewing for. Everybody hears from me, like, what are those top 3 or 4 things that are really important to you out of a new organization? And I am circling back to that at the end of it, right? And look, there's an old adage that every candidate lies amongst recruiters. That, I've been a recruiter for over a decade now, so there's a cynical part of me that agrees with that. But, realistically, I think you're going to figure out somebody's true intentions as they go through this process. And, for us, our culture is very big about, somebody being honest and transparent and, being willing to kind of bubble up issues that might be left under the surface. And so we'll ask those questions about how they're feeling. The recruiters do a lot of checking in through the process after each interview of, hey, how did that go? Hopefully so-and-so didn't scare you away. What did you enjoy about it? What do you want to, what else would you like to learn? Here's who we're going to talk to you with next. And so I think with all of those checkpoints and check-ins through the process, we have a pretty good gut sense. I would say 9 times out of 10, we can accurately predict who's going to accept our offer and who's going to turn us down. But it really comes back to just leaning on those things that were most important. And if you're well positioned to highlight those things, right? Like Toptal's profile, we get a lot of people who, were an entrepreneur or worked for a big company and just snapped one day. They're like, I can't do the red tape thing anymore. I got to get out of this and I want to work for something more nimble and dynamic. That's something that we can always draw back to if we're talking to somebody from, a 200,000 person company. It's like, look, there's 700 people here. Like, you're going to be able to see your impact.
Yeah.
And so I think, going back to the things that are most important to the candidate and also painting the picture for what it's going to look like when they join the team, right? This is something where every startup has lofty ambitions. Otherwise, why would you start the company? And so being able to transmit that vision that you have for where this organization is going to go and what they can be a part of, again, this goes back to if you set it up from the front end and really clearly define the job and what it's going to look like, you can go deep and answer those questions. And then I would just say, if there are those concern areas that are bubbling up that the candidate has, answer them honestly. It may be that becomes a deal breaker and you lose the candidate, but anybody who's hired the wrong hire will agree that it's way better to find that out before they get into the organization and cause all sorts of damage. So in my mind, they're almost doing you a favor if they're waffling at the end. And when you dig in and have an honest conversation, you can advise them, hey, look, maybe this isn't the best thing for you. And I found that to be effective too, just being honest with somebody of like, look, maybe this isn't the right fit. Sometimes, folks who are interviewing are not doing this every day. So it's hard to break up. It's, the same things that we all have problems with in other, interpersonal relationships. You have that time invested in both sides of this thing for an interviewer. So, or for a candidate. So if you sometimes just bubbling up those questions and being able to have an honest discussion about it makes it a hell of a lot easier for them to get at peace with whatever the right decision is for them. And then, as a hiring team, you have to realize you're working with humans, right? Like they are at the end of the day going to make the best decision for their family. So there's some times where you just might not be able to get it over the fence, and that's okay too. It's not necessarily a shortcoming from your organization. Richard Branson says a business opportunity is like a bus. There's always another one. Recruiting is the same way. I mean, it hurts when you lose a candidate at the end of the process, but we've had plenty of those circumstances where that's happened and we've thought it was a disaster. And then the person we ended up getting into that role ended up being a 10 times better fit.
That's a nice story. Heartwarming to know that you always find someone. One of the things that I thought has been really interesting that you keep coming back to is culture. And one of the things that I found really fascinating about Toptal is that you do a culture interview with all your candidates, which not a lot of companies do. So can you tell me why you do this in addition to your standard, job interview, and what types of things you're asking candidates during a culture interview?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's been something that we've implemented over the last couple of years that's really taken off. We've gotten a lot of really good feedback about that. But, Toptal's culture is very specific. We value people who are driven, skilled, unifying, ambitious, inspiring, challenging, revealing, understanding, knowledgeable, and most importantly, I think is helpful. I think I hit all of them there. But the focus on those types of attributes, I mean, when you're talking about that 4 to 5 hours of conversations, a lot of times you can suss that out. And we're evaluating culture in real time. But when you have that many attributes that you're hoping that your candidates, embody to some degree, there's going to be times where you're not able to really get that firm, okay, is this person going to, not only work well here, but enjoy it here? It's got to be a good fit for both sides. And so, we developed this cultural ambassador program where we have Toptal interviewers. They sit down with a candidate for 30 minutes at the end of the process. They're typically not on the same team as the candidate. So, they really don't have a horse in the race one way or the other. It could be somebody from our engineering team interviewing a senior corporate counsel on our legal team, right? And the whole goal of that is just to give the candidate a safe space to let their hair down and say like, okay, what is it really like to work here? I saw these things throughout the interview process. Have you seen that? Did you have an issue with X, Y, or Z coming in? Questions that you might feel could disqualify you as a candidate. but are important to you from a decision-making process, right? Like we can't walk you around the office and show you where the cool cafeteria is and, hey, here's the bars we like to hit after work. Like it's a different culture. And so, I think it really helps the candidate assess whether or not this is going to be the right place for them. And, from our side, it's that kind of additional gut check. More often than not, I don't want to say it's a rubber stamp, but they're validating what we have already seen through the interview process. So as far as kind of questions, we really tailor those questions to hit specific areas of those values that I mentioned, right? So for example, if you're going to assess if someone is driven, you can ask about a time that a candidate went above and beyond on something or, needed to take ownership of something that they weren't planning on. How did that turn out? What steps did they take? For inspiring, I like to ask about what somebody's passionate about, right? For me, I don't care what it is, as long as they're passionate about something, right? Like if they can get you excited about it, that's a good sign. And there's probably an element of their work, which is their chosen profession, that they're going to be that excited about. Like I had a candidate the other day getting me all geeked up about some sci-fi fiction series that, I haven't read. I haven't read a lot of sci-fi fiction, but by the end of the interview, I ended up with a new book in my Audible library, right? So you get these nice little bonuses of things that, maybe you weren't expecting to learn, but you have that chance to kind of spend time that's not that formal. Hey, here's the job, can you do it kind of elements that I think the rest of the interview process feels. And we do check-ins with our folks once they get on board, and that's one of the biggest pieces of feedback that we hear was unique and something that candidates really valued. So for us, it's been awesome.
Does that help people who you were talking about who may not perform as well in a traditional interview setting kind of loosen up and give you a better sense of what kind of job candidate they would be?
It can. I think, it depends on how somebody prepares for an interview, because I think a lot of times, we try our best to be informal. The fact that I'm wearing a polo shirt here is probably the most formal I will be at Toptal in 2021. But we want to do our best. Like everybody's working from home. Everybody has their home life. Like, you can see parts of people's life in their background. Half the time I get on a call and somebody's like, oh, I bet you play guitar. Easy things to have that conversation about. But some people are just very, very tense when they prepare for an interview. So they might not take that opportunity to, be a little bit more casual. I think from Toptel's side, we've evaluated that before they get to the culture interview, because the culture interviewer isn't really interviewing for role specific parts of this. So, how somebody's going to operate in a high stress situation, like we should have probably vetted that out earlier in the process. But I do see a lot of candidates just sharing that they felt very comfortable. They felt like they got a good view into a different part of the business. They got a good understanding of what it's like to really work here. So, I think it's a value add for them, but whether or not, I don't know, there's times where we've seen stellar feedback on a culture interview where we go, oh, wow, we didn't see that in some of those prior interviews. And then that's something you can kind of touch on in the follow-up call when you're making an offer or doing kind of that mop-up conversation if there's any outstanding details, or just saying like, hey, you really impressed so-and-so in your culture interview. Like, how did you enjoy that? And you can see what it was that made them tick. Because people, if it's a good experience on one side, it's usually a pretty good experience on the other. And they'll, tell you about the conversation and what they liked and why they had a good time with it.
Excellent. So to sum up here, you've gone through the interview process, you've found your perfect candidate. What do you do to bring them on board in a remote environment seamlessly?
Yeah, that's the the new challenge for a lot of folks, and it is a huge challenge, especially if it's an organization that has been historically, brick and mortar, and now, either you have some folks in the office and some remote, or everybody remote. Even when I joined in 2017, this was my first remote gig ever, and so there's that sense of like, am I even joining a real company? Like, what's going to happen on Monday? So, a lot of our onboarding program is really set up to dissuade those fears. Our onboarding team does a phenomenal job of providing the very white glove service to all of our new hires. And I think they're able to do that and provide that much one-on-one attention because they automate as much as possible on the front end. So, you know, even before their start date, and through their first days, they're getting automated prompts to set up addresses, direct deposit information, their email signatures, just like the basic blocking and tackling stuff of, you have joined Toptal, how do you work here? It's all self-guided. You know, the way my onboarding partner mentioned it, she said it's simple but dummy proof, right? It's self-guided onboarding courses in our learning management system that they can go through at their own pace. We kind of give them the target of, hey, it'd be nice to complete this in the first week. It's only a couple of hours, so they can pick and choose in between their meetings to sit down and cover that stuff. Our onboarding team checks in with them over the course of the first couple of weeks. So they're getting a lot of that attention just from the people part of the organization, but then from the hiring manager side of the organization, you know, and this goes back to, again, thinking all of this out. We make sure that the hiring manager prepares a day-to-day agenda for their first 2 weeks. So this is everything from introduction calls to, you know, recurring team meetings to getting them synced up with stakeholders that are going to play a part in their world. So I think that really helps a lot of our members kind of join, and teammates feel like, okay, I'm here. They have a plan for me. I sort of know what I'm supposed to be doing. So, you know, this at least helps me, you know, get the car running. And then, you know, as they get set in and start to, you know, do some work and join these meetings and everything, we have a lot of periodical checks through that process, right? So if I hire somebody and you're starting on your first day, sorry, Forbes, welcome here, Kristin, but you know, it's gonna, day one, hey, welcome to the team. There's a lot of information here. Let me know if there's anything I can do to help you out. You know, by day 5, it's like, okay, do you hate me yet? Or have you enjoyed everything so far? Are you getting your feet wet? And then, you know, we do 30 days, 60 days. Our people team checks in after 100 days. And really, it's the whole goal of that is just make sure, you know, one, people are settling in. I'd say 90% of those conversations are very warm and fuzzy, right? Like just they're enjoying it. They feel great. The teams are great. 5 or 10% of the time, there's some issues that are bubbling up. And I think that's vitally important too. The first 90 days of somebody joining the organization can make or break whether or not they're going to be a long-term employee. So if there's issues, you know, it could be small issues around not knowing how to access certain parts of tech or not knowing who to ask about a thing, right? Those things are pretty normal. But we also hear about other things of, hey, my hiring manager or my manager didn't set clear expectations, or I kind of feel like I'm adrift, or I don't know if I'm on all the important meetings that I'm supposed to be on. So, you know, if you have some of those data points coming in those check-ins, then it's, you know, hey, let's jump on with the manager, make sure they're aware of what's going on. You know, let's get the feedback from the manager side as well. And that's something we do, you know, kind of on a more regular cadence, because the recruiting team is typically meeting with the hiring teams every week or so to update on searches and see how everybody's been doing. So if we're hearing it on the other side for the candidate, you know, we'll get that feedback. It's typically on the manager to provide that and make sure that they're coaching their employees appropriately, but it's a discussion point, right? And I think they might be thinking it's not as big a deal, but we've heard that happen and, you know, heard things go off the rails previously. So we will say like, oh, hold on, you actually need to pay attention to that.
Yeah. Yeah. Mike, this has been so great. Thank you so much for all of the incredibly helpful and useful advice. I'm sure it's really going to hit home for a lot of people trying to navigate this year, and who have been navigating it for the past year. So I really appreciate you being here and taking the time.
Yeah, no, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much, Kristin. It's been an awesome experience, and hopefully this was helpful, and I wish everybody the best of luck. It is a daunting challenge to get this thing up and running from a remote perspective, but I don't know, I've been remote for almost 4 years now and I'm never going back. So I wish you all a lot of success with it, and you know, hope you're able to build the teams that are going to get you to that next level.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thanks.